Good morning. You're listening to Drinking Socially, the official Untappd podcast.
Your inside look at what's happening in the Untappd community and the world of beer.
I'm John, and be honest with me, be honest with yourself. You never thought you'd be listening to a podcast about yeast. Well, fortunately, this one's about beer and Untappd and, well, yeast. But this is the fourth installment in our Beer 101 series, and Harrison's going to be answering some questions about the microscopic fourth ingredient in all of your beer.
And I'm Harrison, and it's alive! No, not Dr. Frankenstein's monster. That was just a metaphor. I'm talking about your beer. Well, part of your beer, some beers sometimes, not really the beer. We're, of course, talking about yeast. And it's a pretty big deal. I'd call it yeast the soul of the beer, but that would be playing right into Mary Shelley's hands. I don't want to do that. So I'm going to forego that, just kind of, say that yeast it can be the most complex part of your beer experience. And we're going to drink two beers today that are really well known for the role yeast plays in every sip you take. But before we get to sipping, as a reminder, Drinking Socially is released every other Wednesday morning. It can be found at podcast.untappd.com.
Or wherever you listen to podcasts or watch them. If you're on
That's
YouTube,
right.
check it out there as well.
Indeed. All right, cool. So it's that time again, John. I'm not going to say it. So I'm going to say it's our favorite new part. I said it. But
It's all right. It's how I know that we're getting to the weekend catch-up
Right.
segment, right?
Yeah, and as I recall from check-in photos, you had some good ones kind of coming up, but maybe had a little bit of a journey to find
man.
the beers you enjoyed recently.
So the part that I was talking to Harrison about before we were recording tonight is, we're doing an episode focusing on yeast, and for me, and I think Harrison or probably most of you as well, Belgian beer is a good example of that.
Yeah.
And so I said, on a lunch break, I texting Harrison, I'm going to run out, I'm going to find beers for the next episode. How hard can it be to find a Belgian triple? Well, as I learned, really difficult.
Right.
It was on a day where I was driving around in a car, the air conditioner wasn't working, it was at least 10,000 degrees.
Yep.
There was already frustration in the air, but it took me 3 different stops to find some Belgian beer. And I think you'll see we got pretty close with the Flying
Yeah.
Dog beer we're going to feature, but it was it was one of the times where I was forced to realize that COVID has made such a big impact on beer here in
Yeah.
the States, and it was something I used to take for granted. So I don't know. There's nothing to say about it. It's just it's a different beer buying world that we live in, and Harrison and I think both hope that whatever struggles you're going through to get the beer that you like, it's just as worth it at the end of the sip.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. It certainly is different out there, and it kind of slowly happened, and or maybe some places happen quicker than others. The kind of changes that we've been seeing, and I would even say that some of it's kind of been slowly happening for a long time, where like all of a sudden, most places you walk into is 90% IPAs, and then some other stuff. I didn't even like notice, right? Like Chimay disappearing from most grocery store shelves that used to stock it, and then beers like that are kind of just like a given in my mind that it could always be close by, and at some point in the not too distant past, I guess it kind of disappeared. So,
So
yeah,
right.
interesting.
Chimay, Delirium. I was thinking it wouldn't be hard to
Yeah,
find those at all. But you're right. IPAs have been taking up shelf space, and I know Harrison. Pretty big news for North Carolina this recent weekend as well.
yes. Yeah, so I've been drinking it for a little bit now, but Surly Brewing Company is finally in North Carolina. I didn't even know they were coming or like planning on moving this way or, whatever. They've always been one that I've wanted to enjoy. I had one of their darkness in like a bottle share, had like a sip of it once. It was great. And I've just been kind of like living vicariously through really like other people's check-ins of their beers, describing how great they are. That's like something I'll do when no one's around to jump on Untappd and look at the check-ins of beers that I can't get and be like, if only I could get my hands on them, and so on. So it finally happened though, just like a surprise. Local bottle shop had some Surly, and I grabbed their Extra, which is their like low ABV Citra Pale Ale, and it's awesome. It's sub. I think it's like 4.9% or so, or 4.5 actually. It's even less than that, which is great. As John and I have mentioned in the past, it's kind of like that's the sweet spot. If you can go sub 5, closer to 4, the better, and still pack a punch. I'm always looking for that beer I can sit next to the grill and enjoy while making something on the grill. And this one, like, check that box. I've been kind of riding it all summer. I grabbed a 4-pack and then another 4-pack, and I'll probably get another as I just finished my last one after on the Facebook Live event last night. But it's been great having that go from not being available at all to now I can just go get it whenever I want. And I don't trust that yet. I'm scared it's gonna disappear again, but I don't think it will. I think it's here for a bit. But that's been good.
I remember when that happened with Cigar City a
Yeah.
couple of years ago. It's always, um, y- I think it's exciting. You see these beers that are out of your region. And I remember sometimes you get like some knowledge that Cigar City's coming to North Carolina, and sometimes you get these kind of gifts like Surly landing here.
Yeah.
Um, I
Yeah.
was just recently learned that Great Notion they're already
Ooh.
planned. It's going to open soon. They're opening their first Seattle tap room. They've got,
Wow.
I think, three in and around Portland, Oregon.
Right.
So they're
Right.
coming to Seattle now.
That's
Their
awesome.
their double stack, which is I think their number one checked in beer on Untappd, is
Yeah.
in the fridge at the Untappd
That's
office.
right.
We were going to feature it on the podcast, and we just packed everything up and left, thinking 3, 4, 5 weeks we'll be
Right.
back in the
We'd be
office.
back.
So one
Oops.
day, one day we're going to feature Great Notion
Oh
once
yeah.
once we get back in the office. Those guys are incredible.
Yeah, they really are. And we've been looking forward to that. It's a beer we talked about and kind of were right, not worried that it was going to, didn't need very quickly because it's got quite the ABV in it and on it and would last as long as we needed it to. But now I'm kind of like, oh boy, maybe we're even pushing that to the max. It's going to be, maybe we can do it a cellared episode or something in the future, accidentally cellared beer. We planned on drinking kind of fresh, but then this all happened. What can you do? But yeah, that's cool about them moving to Seattle and open up a new spot. That's such a great beer city, obviously, and to bring more great stuff to it. The rich get richer, John, and that's awesome. Awesome for people in
Yeah,
Seattle.
yeah, totally. Seattle's a great beer city. Pacific Northwest, I know by proxy, Seattle and Portland. There's something I'm not researched enough to really speak on, but Reuben's Brews,
Mm,
I saw that they were doing some sort of virtual beer where you could help brew the beer
huh,
virtually. And that's it. That's the headline I read, and I meant to look
right.
more into it today before we got around to recording, but
Yeah,
this
that's
is life.
awesome.
The dogs needed a bath.
That's right.
But for those of you fortunate enough to live nearby, or if you're reading this and you know how to Google, you'll probably get some better answers than me making them up.
Right.
And that is an awkward formed transition into our first beer on episode 16.
Yes. Excited to drink.
So this is the product of me endlessly shopping around for some sort of Belgian beer, and it comes from. Well, I'll tell you the story after we open the beer. Let's get to the vitals. This beer, Raging Bitch by Flying Dog, is a Belgian-style IPA. It comes in at 8.3% ABV and brings 60 IBUs. This beer has a lot going on. A sweet malt body is contrasted by pine and grapefruit hop flavors and some exotic fruit notes. And Harrison's going to kind of talk about that
Yeah.
as we drink the beer, how yeast plays a role here. My first experience with Raging Bitch, I was like drinking through Flying Dog's catalog on the
Mm-hmm.
grocery store shelf, and I got to this
Yep.
one, and I remember thinking like, "Whoa, this is it's just different." For somebody that's learning and maybe doesn't have a broken encyclopedia of information in their head, when you get to this, like yes, Belgian styles are a real thing. The yeast definitely adds some character to this beer that you
Yeah.
won't find in others, right? I'm excited to
Yeah.
hear Harrison. I've never checked it in, which
Yeah,
is
yeah, I know. I don't think I have either. And this beer was again, I feel like well, we've been doing a good job recently of drinking some pretty serious beers, pretty famous when it comes to American craft beers the past couple episodes with Sierra Nevada and Sam Adams and Fat Tire and all this stuff we've been having a blast enjoying. So I feel like I'm on repeat here, but to say it again, this beer, I remember right the first time I had it, and not even that. I remember that this was like when Belgian IPAs were happening, like
Yes,
somewhere
Green
in but right.
Flash. I remember doing one.
Exactly, La Freak. That's
Yep.
what I was gonna bring up. I had that at the Blind Tiger in New York City on Bleecker Street, which is like a tiny craft beer bar. There, more taps in there than there could be people. How small it is, but always filled up to the max. I had La Freak there for the first time, and that was in the middle of that, like, but in between West Coast IPAs and New England IPAs, there was this like spark of Belgian IPAs were the new thing and exciting, and enjoying things like this Piraat as well, which is an actual Belgian IPA, or I think it was originally just a Belgian pale ale, but it's like a really bitter one. It's awesome. But so yeah, this was like a very serious chapter in my beer journey, was Belgian IPAs. What are they? This is crazy. And this was one of this and Le Freak were like the two that like I remember the most, of like having them being like, what is this? Here we are.
It is.
Ooh.
It's a stark contrast on most of the beers I drink. And if there's a weak spot in my own beer check-in history, Untappd history, it's Belgian style beers, and I blame it on the yeast. It kicks
Yeah.
off an estery fruitness
Yeah.
that just, it's not something to me that is really appealing. And I'll say so objectively, for me, this is not a beer that I would find myself singing praises on. And there's nothing against Flying Dog or the beer. That Belgian yeast just
Right.
hits me in a way that
Right. It's yep.
yeah,
It's different.
and we'll see. It's 8.3. I haven't
Yeah.
had any beers today, and I'm thirsty as heck. We'll see how I
Exactly.
feel at the
There's
end of
exactly
it. But
right.
that's something I'm not afraid to admit.
Sure.
No strikes against anyone that made it. Arguably, Belgian brewers are some of the most talented history has ever known. But for
Sure.
me, this is a style I have to work hard to enjoy.
Yeah, and it's definitely different. It's like it's I don't want to say an acquired taste, 'cause that sounds ridiculous, but it is like a Belgian beers are famous because they're so different. Like that's why they're exciting, and because they can't make those kind of beers. Well, up until a time, couldn't make them outside of Belgium because the yeast that were there could only live and exist there, and that's what gave them this unique character. Obviously, now with this yeast, which actually is obviously really important. In this beer, the name of the beer, which we can talk about in a moment, kind of comes from the yeast itself. But this is now all kind of propagated in labs, and that's why you can be in Maryland, where Flying Dog is, and make a Belgian style IPA and use yeast that was cultured and originally from Belgium. But forever, that's the uniqueness of that country, and the beer it could create was part of the draw. But it's also right the first time you have it, even if you're like not new to beer, it's like, what is going on here? Sometimes it can taste like potpourri or like a weird Christmas decoration or something. Like there's clovey things
Yes.
happening sometimes. There is spicy things, there are piney things. Sometimes I think what drew me to the to this style, or made it interesting um, early on, was it almost like the funkiness of it, the spiciness of it could almost turn up the hops that were in it into like a different. It just did something different to it, where you get a really spicy, like a Warrior, like a Willamette, like a uh, hop that's like already got some kind of spice characteristics to it, and then throw some Belgian yeast on top of it, and it kind of like makes it. It's like a new way. It becomes spicy in a new way. It almost goes from the hop spice to this yeast spice, and you can't tell where one ends and one begins. And that, like the kind of part of my brain that was learning about this was like, what's going on here? How can I tell how is that transition so smooth and interesting? And I remember having that kind of like dialogue in my head in a crowded Bleecker Street bar as people were yelling things at me, and I was missing the fun conversation internally,
Hold
going,
on,
"Oh, I
I'm
wonder
trying
what's
to
happening."
interpret
Right,
the.
something's going on. My brain knows things, but only part of things, and it's trying to put the pieces together with no knowledge. Quiet. Give me 5 hot dogs,
That's
but
you
quiet.
just explained probably everybody's beer journey at some stage,
Oh
right?
man,
Like I
I know.
can't figure out what's happening, but I know enough to want to try.
I know. And the name, so there's the yeast they use in this. They refer to it as El Diablo. It's a Belgian yeast strain, and it's kind of famous for its like volcano-like vigorous fermentation. So it rages along, as the name would suggest, and can become kind of a mess to handle. And they're great stories, and homebrew forums of other guys using it, and other breweries using it, where it's just, like, it made a mess. They walk in the next day after brewing, and the bucket's tops blown off in the closet, and all their shirts are covered in gross gunk and beer, and all that stuff. So, which is just part of the experience. But I love that their description on their website says, enjoy its golden glow and white foaming head alongside bold flavors like spicy barbecue wings, blue cheese, salads, or that bag of family-sized Cool Ranch Doritos you're going to destroy later while binge watching Netflix. I loved. I was cracking up. I read that and I was like, "You got me. You just described what a great night that is. Wings, a blue cheese salad. What an honest way to describe a salad. I'll have some blue cheese with a side of lettuce, please.
Two
Here's your
pieces of
salad,
romaine.
sir."
Yeah. I want to feel healthy.
I love
Honestly, that description of this beer, or perhaps of the greatest night of your late 30s,
Sure.
that makes me like, I would be excited to have this beer again and pair it with like some wicked spicy chicken
Yes.
wings.
Yes.
And I think there is where there's so much flavor packed into this beer that blue cheese, the chicken wings, like this beer is going to stand up to it.
Yeah. It also refers to it as a backyard knife fight on your palate, which is that was a more aggressive way of when I was talking about the hops and the yeast kind of coming together. They're seen as a coming together of a duel. It was more harmonious in my brain, but now I'm like, you're right. It does
Like
feel
an
like
Italian family dinner.
You're exactly right.
Everybody's
exactly right. Exactly. Pass the knife. Pass the bread. Ah. Yeah. I know.
That's a great explanation of this beer. It's like joining a very loud argument at a bar.
Right,
There's just
right.
a lot of people arguing for your
Right,
attention as
right.
you try and process it.
I know it is. Exactly right. There's a lot going on. It's fun. It's one of those beers that does change as it warms up and it becomes a little more interesting. I think it just changes. It's just different. Gotta sit here and hold it in my hand. Crystal clear, nice copper color. I mean, and obviously this beer's been around for a while. I mean, Flying Dog themselves have been brewing. They started in Colorado in 1990s. They've been doing this for longer than I think a lot of people realize. They, in the early 2000s, bought the brewery they currently use in Frederick, Maryland, and then in 2007 shut down the Colorado operations and just moved to Maryland. But interesting personal connection to these guys is that when I was at Neshaminy Creek, we somehow, and that's a longer story, ended up with the first brew house they had. I believe the one from 1990. I think they had two different locations in Colorado at one point in the early 90s. So I'm unsure exactly which one we got, but it was when they left Colorado, they sold it to, I think, some like entrepreneur was gonna open his own brewery, never did. It sat in a barn in Pennsylvania for years, and we were like lucky enough to find it before we opened up, after the person we paid to build our brew house from scratch disappeared with all our money. So he did that to a lot of people. I don't remember his name. There's a whole company, and there's tons of there's interesting articles about it. He did to a lot of like startup breweries in the mid 2010s, whatever you call that. I don't know. That time period, the last decade,
sometime in the 10s.
Sure, in the 10s, not the 1910s or the 1810s. Yeah. Anyway, so that's like a different story. But yeah, so I brewed on their original brewer house forever, and it was awesome. A huge stainless steel thing that was very simple, 2-vessel system, but it may very well have brewed. I don't remember when this beer came to be first, but maybe brewed early iterations of this beer as well at one point in the past. But
that's another small world story. Just today,
Exactly.
I was on the phone with a brewery in, I want to say it was south of Cleveland, Ohio. And we were just kind of talking about, like one of the questions I always ask a brewer when I'm on the phone with them is, what prompted you to get into this industry? Which has changed over, 5 years ago. You're more of like an early adopter. Now, I almost expect everyone to say, I just love beer and I wanted to make my own. But as long as you get home brewers and you get on, you get all kinds of really cool stories about what prompted you to become a professional brewer. And the one I was talking to, he learned and trained. He got a lot of training from Christian Moreland in Ohio, CMB, and also from Flying Dog.
Nice.
And that's one of the really cool things that I think people forget about when you get these brewers that kind of
Yeah.
elevate their business to like that upper echelon, maybe
Hmm.
not all the way to ABI's s- world, but the next, like Lagunitas and
Sure.
New Belgium and Flying Dog, where you get to that level, you almost become like you start to create more brewers just because
Oh
of what
yeah.
you've done. It's a great source
Sure.
of education for people.
Yep. Yeah. As of today, 2.5 million plus check-ins Flying Dog overall has on
Wow.
Untappd from more than 600,000 different people. I've checked in a few of them. I got to look back and see those check-ins. And then
Yeah, me too.
Rageovich itself, 315,000 check-ins, 700 plus this month. So again, it's been around for more than a hot minute. It is, and they have tons of variants too, which I can talk about in a sec. But it's their number one checked-in beer, followed by Snake Dog, which is a really cool IPA of theirs as well. They have a lot of. I mean, again, they're one of those breweries that have been doing it for a while. But every time I revisit them, I'm like, oh, that's right, they made that beer. They made that beer. Holy cow! They did the whole Dead Rise Old Bay beer, which I guess is like a regional. I love Old Bay
Oh man,
seasoning.
Dead Rise gets
Right.
there's like a cult following for
Sure,
that beer.
there is. I love it. I think it's hilarious, but the people who don't know what it is, it's kind of like a weird thing, and I get it, totally get it. But embrace the Old Bay, put it on your French fries, and yeah, I mean, again, a lot of story, but very interesting. They went from Colorado to Maryland, and they're like killing it in Maryland and all that
I think
stuff.
they would get a lot of credit for kind of building Maryland. I mean, Maryland as a state is arguably really small,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
but there's a lot of talent in both food and beer in Maryland, and I would give
Sure.
Flying Dog a lot of credit for kind of paving the way.
Yeah. Certainly
It,
early on. Oh yeah.
it's been almost 3 years since I've checked into a Flying Dog beer, and the last I know immediately when I go and look at my check-in history, it's the Heat series. They did a jalapeno white ale,
Oh
they did a
yeah.
ancho lime lager, they did Fever Dream, and I think I checked into all of them like within 5 days of each other. Which
That's
was
great.
any I love that they did like just I think it was probably a mixed six pack of spicy beers,
Right.
and I thought that was and of course I get picked on a lot with some of the check-ins back then. There's a lot of misspellings, so that was good times back then.
Yeah, I had a few back in 2015 and 2016. The last one I had was their doggy style pale ale, which is a great pale ale. I just remember, and my check-in is always game for that, whatever the heck that means. But I just remember it being like one of those very go-to, very go-to, pale ales where it's very citrusy, it's crisp, refreshing. So again, like I love. There's so many breweries out there, obviously, but the ones that have been doing it for a while. If you haven't checked in with them, I know we say it a lot, but go look back into places that you maybe haven't enjoyed a beer from in a bit. They're always all just putting out great, interesting stuff all the time, whether it's new or one like this one we're having tonight that we just haven't had in a while.
So true.
Um,
Even like my disdain for Belgian yeast flavoring beers.
I know.
It's true. I mean, if we go out to dinner, there's going to be someone that doesn't want calamari. There's going to be someone that doesn't
Sure.
want a rare steak. I'm that way with Belgian beers, but as I'm down to like my last third of this one, especially thinking about pairing it with some spicy food, I
Exactly.
really want to come back here and try
I
this
know.
again.
I know.
Um,
It may bold statement, but it really may be. It may be one of the best because we talk about that a lot. A lot of people talk about beer and food pairings, and it's almost like whatever you want with whatever you want. Like there's no
that's the rule,
wrong, right?
right?
There's no
That
wrong
is the
answer,
rule.
right? But right as we're drinking this, it's like I can almost taste how well like right hot wings would go or a spicy calamari would go with this. Like you can kind of see where it would fit in this profile that is malty. It kind of hits a lot of like spicy malty notes, and it's missing like the heat of the spice. It would almost be like the spice of the wings to the spice of the hop to the spice of the yeast, and like a three for combo thing happening there all at once. That would be just really interesting to experience. So yeah, this could be a really great style and specific beer to pair with food. I wish we were doing that now, but that they don't want to
Same.
hear us chewing.
Yeah.
You don't want that. You don't want that in your ear.
Yeah, we need to figure out auto mic ducking
Auto
when I
right.
chew. AI is not quite there yet,
We got
but
there.
speaking of Harrison and I making mistakes or eating live on the air,
Yeah.
those of you that are interested, we began trying to challenge ourselves to produce a little bit more content while we're all stuck at home, not reading the books we should be reading. Um, so if you're in the Facebook group, we release a new podcast every other Wednesday, and
Right.
the Wednesdays in between, Harrison and I are starting a YouTube live event, for lack of
Correct.
better understanding or name. But we were in there last week. There was thanks to the 12 of you that tuned in. It was unannounced. It was unmarketed.
Anything? Yeah.
Yeah, we just kind of got together and jumped on and started the camera up live and drank a beer. And it was, I don't know about you, Harrison, but it was it was really nice just to go live. We had some things we wanted to talk about, but to be able to kind of see someone post something and engage right away,
Yeah.
that sort of content was really exciting to
Yep.
produce.
I know, it's great. That's a fun, Facebook group. If you aren't in it yet, go ahead and join it. It's a blast. A lot of great posts, great pictures, great ideas, people creating polls, having thoughts and opinions and stuff. And we kind of spent most of the time polling our favorite posts from the past couple of weeks, and we'll do that again. Pretty much every other Wednesday that there's not a podcast, jump on Facebook and find us there to kind of go through what we've been laughing about or enjoying. You guys sharing in the group. It's been fun.
Speaking of polls, we did one, and we asked what was your favorite poolside beer, and the answer was not unanimous, but it was a runaway.
Yeah.
And everybody's favorite poolside beer was anything craft and local.
Classic. Love that
very,
one.
very true to form. The answer was actually not an answer,
Right.
specific enough for us to grab that beer and put it on the podcast. But at the end of the day, I don't think that matters. Like, what's really cool to see is that it doesn't matter where you live. Your favorite beer usually comes
Right.
from within
Right.
10 miles away from you.
Right.
And that's the world I want to live in. That's
Right.
great.
That is cool. Right. Or what you're doing. Right. It used to be, and even my head is still wired of like a little bit pool beer, lawn beer, deck beer, grill beer, like all these weird, I don't know why I'm so segmented or whatever, but I guess that's just how my brain is just boring like that. But nice, right, that it's like anything craft, anything local all the time. Okay, cool. That's good with me. Whatever I'm doing, as long as local and craft, I'm happy about it. So that was exciting as well to see, and we'll throw some more cool things up there this week probably. Maybe take it onto Twitter too. If you're not following us over there already, we do have a Twitter too that we have some fun with because we can do more polls and stuff over there. You can follow us at That Beer Podcast on Twitter and see what we're kind of our stream of consciousness can get a little interesting over there. So check it out if you haven't. But we got another beer to drink. Before we do though, let's hear from one and only the Untappd store. What's going on there? This guy, right? Oops, there it is. I can never, every time it's wrong. Just like, what pocket did I put my keys in? Not that pocket, not the one I
last
just,
one you
right.
check, which is right on so many levels.
Right, exactly.
Probably would stop checking after you found them, but not the first one you check.
That's right. But let's listen to this. We'll talk to you guys in a second.
Want to show off your love of Untappd? Check out our online store and pick up Untappd branded glassware, shirts, sweatshirts, hats, more. Depending on how hot or cold you are, go to store.untappd.com and enter the coupon code podcast when you check out. That'll get 20% off anything you order. That's store.untappd.com. Use the coupon code podcast, 20% off for you. Plus, it lets them know that you guys are listening, and we love that here.
All right, it's that time to drink more beer. We're jumping into beer number 2. It's a classic. We just talked about it. John just added it to his mount. Beermore. There it is. Boom. Franziskaner, or in Philly, a Frank or a Frankie or something like that is how you could order it, and people would usually know what you meant. The full name is the Franziskaner Premium Weiss Beer Natural True, but Franziskaner is just how people refer to it.
Not many people order it that way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That would be a lot to say. You don't need to. Frankie hopefully gets you what you want, although could also send you down the weird night. Brewery it used to be obviously Franziskaner, but now Spaten, Franziskaner, and Lowenbrau have a group, a parent group that brews this guy. But more importantly, it's a Hefeweizen, 5%, 12 IBUs, and coming from Untappd, It says Franziskaner is a natural and elegant wheat beer protagonist from Bavaria with a lush white foam. The copper golden wheat beer with yeast over opalescence unfolds an aromatic fragrance with harmonious fruit in which bananas and citrus fruit greet. So that was translated from Dutch, I believe, but we get it. And this is, I mean, so it's on Year Mound Beermore for great reason. And it's I love this beer. The first time I ever saw it, it was like one of the, I guess it would be, what would that be, like a 500 ml or a bigger, slightly bigger bottle of it, and somebody brought like like a glass, put it upside down on it,
Oh,
and then
nice.
flipped the whole thing. And I was like, well, this is this guy's first day on the job. He doesn't know how to pour a beer. What a moron!
I'll get
And
you a
that's
towel.
right, exactly right. Good luck, kid. Don't quit your college, whatever. But that's how you can pour it out of the bottle into a wheat beer, and that's kind of how you should. I learned later. Today I don't have that size bottle or that kind of glass, so I'm making do. But anyway, this beer was, as we kind of mentioned on your when you put this on Mount Beermore for you, it's everywhere in Philly. I love this beer. I'm so pumped to drink because I probably haven't had it really maybe since I've lived there, which was 4+ years ago. So this is going to send me a lot of stories are coming, John. Get ready. It's going to send me back.
It's been a long time for myself. I last checked into this beer in 2015. And we were talking about it when we just updated Mount Beermore. So bringing it onto the show so quick. If you listened earlier, you heard me talking about the difficulty in finding imported beer during COVID. So Franziskaner was available, and it was just I'm really excited to drink this. This is the even during, especially in the States during COVID, we've seen a huge kind of resurgence in nostalgic beers. You buy your beer, one, you're probably looking for more value than you used to when a $16 4-pack was just exciting. But also that nostalgia, I think, is natural. Like I saw Ashley the other day looking at knitting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to replay that conversation, but under no circumstance did I ever think like we should probably set up a chair for knitting in this house. And now it seems okay. So Franziskaner on the menu. This is exciting. Well, initially, I would also get offered a lemon with my Franziskaner, which I equate to like. I'd imagine it complements the flavors in this beer very well. It's got a carbonation or mouthfeel, unlike most others. And I attribute a lot of that to the yeast. I'm sure everything else that touches this beer as well. But
oh yeah, for sure.
I mean, look at that cloud on this thing. I know.
It looks beautiful, smells beautiful. I poured most of it into the glass, and then took probably 1.5 ounces or 2 ounces in the bottle, swirled it up, dumped it in. That's kind of the move. I think the larger bottle has that as like the instruction on the back of it. If I
like swirl and pour.
Right, swirl and pour, exactly. Might have been this one or Paul Nur's or Vine Stefan's, but
some beers you want to leave that sediment. Some beers it's actually beneficial.
Sure, and it's really personal preference. Like if you like it, great. If you're not, into the banana and clove roller coaster we're about to get on, maybe don't dump that last season. If you're a home brewer, save it and make your own beer out of it. You can turn that. You can use it again.
First sip into this thing, man.
I'm so excited.
It's a vibrant, lively roller coaster. It's the wheat beer that I was in love with before I even knew what wheat beers were. Tell me what's going on right now, right? It's just.
I'm taken back. I'm in Brauhaus Schmitz, which is a huge beer hall on South Street in Philadelphia, watching a football game, which is a soccer game. I'm eating sausage. I mean, this is like, right. So there's so many. John, the words escape me. It's such it's so, I don't know how it's like, I feel like I've said this before about other beers, but it's like Galileo drawing a circle freehand or whatever, or Da Vinci, whoever did that, where it's like, that's the most difficult, one of those guys who had pens and pencils back in the day. But that, it was like, that's such a difficult thing to do, to make the perfect cheeseburger, or to, but it's, when you do it, it's like this masterpiece. And I'm not even gonna say simplicity, because it's so complex, but in like a refreshing way, where like I'm so used to almost like challenging my taste buds to fight through all these hops in a big old IPA to find out what I'm really tasting. Here it's like this soft pill. It's nicely acidic. It's very bubbly. It's got some carbonation, but it's like it's almost like I feel like I'm going down like a waterfall of just like oranges, and I crash into a bunch of bananas in the bottom of a lake that also some cool guy is smoking a clove next to, and I'm just like, where is this place? What
Where
weird?
is this place?
What cruise am I on? This
It's
is
the advanced Airbnb.
right, but
Um,
it's just it's so good. It's so, and it right. It almost feels like, oh man, I don't know how to put this into words well, but it's almost like they have a secret that no one else knows yet, and they're like winking at you about it. Like, yes, you and like right, you don't need to have 1,000 ingredients to make a complex beer. Just like let the yeast do the talking, and it'll take you most of the way there.
and they're
Um,
singing in this. I mean, the banana Weinstefaner makes a beer called Vitus that to me is the most banana flavored beer I've
right,
ever had.
yeah,
But this is unmistakable. Like we did when we did the virtual festival together, however long ago it's been, with time meaning nothing anymore.
yep,
We did a blind taste test, and I put some beers in front of you, and I believe I also eschewed a chocolate milk in there and some actual orange juice, and you did remarkable in determining which beer was which, or which was actually
right,
not a beer.
right,
This is a beer. You could blind taste test me this beer, and I would wager that I would identify this
sure,
beer
right, right.
10 times out of 10. It's
Oh man,
unmistakably
it's so good.
beautiful, in my
I know,
opinion.
right?
Form
That's
your
it.
own.
That's probably the best word for it, right, John? It's beautiful. I feel like right there's something, I don't know if it's just where some kind of placebo association or something where I know it's been brewed since 1363. Like there's this. It almost feels like I'm looking at a painting that was right. Monet is in the room or something. Like there's just this
Like, how
thing
do you
about it.
describe Starry
Right.
Night?
Right, you shouldn't. If you're trying to talk about it, you're a moron. You should just be quiet and stare at it and try to think about nothing. That's the point, I think, of that of any art. Any great thing is your thoughts disappear, and this occupies something that this beer in this moment that words can't really express. That's the
Ooh,
point.
that's the beer that thinks for you. Maybe that's
Right.
not. Maybe
We're
that's not the direction we need to go
Yes.
in. But
I'm sorry, officer. Yeah, exactly right. But yeah, we don't need to do that. But I know what you're saying is right. It's just this. Right. I feel like I feel silly trying to talk about it. It feels like I've just been taught a lesson by a thing I should have known already, of just drink this beer and be quiet, sit on a mountaintop and drink this beer and you'll know things.
advice from the sage of drinking socially. No, this is when I thought about putting this on my Mount Beermore, I was like,
Yeah.
there's ten
This is
thousand
it.
different versions of a hef in the world right now, maybe more than 10,000. How do I pick Franziskaner as like the
Yeah.
third of my four beers that
Sure.
identify my craft beer experience? But as soon as I pick it up and taste it, if I always, as we drink a beer on Drinking Socially, I think I always want to implore you, if you can, even if it sounds like it's past you've already gone
Right.
past that,
Right.
like
Right.
turn around,
Right.
stop at Franziskaner, pick it up,
Oh,
grab one if you can, grab six if you trust me.
right.
This is a weekend. This is
Right.
I'm just gonna
It's
shut
amazing.
up because I'm just throwing adjectives out. but
Right, but no,
but
but you're right. But you're right. Yeah, again, it's this whole other thing. It's a master class in a glass. Master class in a glass. There it is. There's a T-shirt. Someone will never make. But
so is there, Harrison? We're talking about this, right? Like, how do you recreate
right,
the Scream or other famous pieces of art?
right.
And objectively, you can't. But what can you speculate? Can you hypothesize on maybe what the yeast specifically do to affect the banana, the clove, the flavor that I'm
Sure.
getting in this beer, as opposed to like Blue Moon or a different version of
Right.
this?
Sure. So yes. So it'll be hopefully a little more than a guess, but I mean, well, Blue Moon's an American wheat. This is a German. This is a Hefeweizen, so it has to be minimum. The grain bill is 50% wheat. That's standard. It has to be minimum 50% wheat in the grain bill, which is a lot. You remember from the malt episode we talked about most beers are 70% pale malt. This is in the one of the exceptions where it can't be. It has to be at least 50% wheat and then some pale or pilsner usually. And then maybe a little bit of carrot pills. Like that's it. We made a wheat beer They got to the finals 3 years in a row at the Great American Beer Festival to finish. I think the highest to finish like fifth or fourth, or right outside the medals. But it was like 3 grains in that beer. That was it. And mostly it was a heck of a beer to brew because brewing with wheat, we used rolled wheat, which is basically just like rolled oats in your oatmeal. It's like literally making oatmeal. It's so thick, it looks like cement. We were using a wooden paddle, no rakes, no motors for us, just good old sweat and tears that made all the beers in the Chamonix Creek. So, as it should be. So that's a big factor, but also since it's a German wheat beer, it's using German wheat yeast, which will be more banana and clove focused than something you may use that's similar in like a Belgian wheat or an American wheat beer. But they don't have the same parameters of it needs to be 50% wheat, and then in the yeast that it's probably being used in this is probably not the same one in a Blue Moon or a regularly available American wheat beer. It's just a little bit different. Similar characteristics, but when you kind of put them next to each other, this beer will jump out. It's just the banana clove kind of bubble gum is happening in here as well, like Bazooka Joe
and
bubble gum.
That was something I didn't know. So thank you for that little accidental nugget.
Plenty of those.
A Hefeweizen is mandated that it's 50% wheat in the grain build. An American wheat beer doesn't carry that mandate.
Right.
It's not. I think early on, when I was trying to just like grab and absorb everything about beer, I was like, okay, Hefeweizen just means wheat beer in German. Next.
Right.
But there is a discernible difference there, and I'm sure there's others as well if you want to get into the minutia. But
oh yeah,
sure. that's really cool to know, and discernibly different this particular Franziskaner than any American wheat I've had. Not to say that one's better than the other, but in my opinion, this is a magical journey.
Oh yeah, no, it is, and again, the water plays into it. There's so many factors.
Okay, so talking about all this and yeast, I want to jump right into the Beer 101. This whole episode is kind of built on talking about how yeast plays a role in your beer. Yep. If you're just jumping in, we covered malt, we covered hops, we covered water, and this is going to complete the 4 ingredients in every beer. And then going forward, we're going to get a little bit more granular about it. However,
we're going to apply it.
Yeah, it's John interviewing Harrison, and we're gonna pick his brain about yeast. So without further ado, let's get to Beer 101. And okay, reiterating, by now we know that there's 4 ingredients in every beer.
Yep.
Harrison, the question we're going to begin with, surface level, why is yeast so important to make beer? Why do I need to even put yeast in there? What's it do?
Sure. So in short, it does everything, John. But it was kind of like a common joke, or I don't even know if you call it a joke because it wasn't like that funny. It was kind of just like the truth we all came to accept at the brewery was really like yeast is doing all the work. Like what you do as a brewer is you try and create like the best situation for the yeast you're going to pitch to make a great beer. You're kind of like the sous chef, and the yeast is the iron chef. Like they're doing the stuff. They're really the one that's getting people excited, kind of like Emerald. Instead of going bang bang, they're jumping in there and making booze. So maybe there's some parallels there with the bang and all that stuff. I have a funny Emerald story. We'll share that some other time.
Emerald says bam. But
yeah, bam, bang, doesn't matter. Whatever, yeah, bang, bam. It was late. The story quickly is that the reason he used to say that is no one wanted to make a show about cooking, so they made him film it at like 1 a.m, and to keep his cameramen awake, he would go bam. It wasn't for the audience; it was to wake up his crew. So bang, bam, whatever. I don't remember who told me. Someone from the Food Network told me that.
Yep, I remember hearing that story.
Okay, good.
I wish I could remember her name, but she's brilliant. She started at school. She's amazing.
Yeah, but I loved that, and I was like, okay, all right, I'll bite on that. So yeah, bam, bang. Don't worry about me.
Got it. So the yeast is doing all the work. It's the iron chef of the brew.
It is. I mean, easily is doing all the work, and your job as a brewer is to not mess it up, so that when the yeast jumps in there, it's able to actually do what it's supposed to do. You're giving it a great. We're talking about happy yeast all the time in a brewery. You want to make sure it's good, happy yeast, and there's lots of things you can do to make that happen. But the point of that statement is that your job is to create something that the yeast is going to ferment the heck out of and do what it's supposed to do in.
So that being said, yeast is the catalyst which can create fermentation, which
Yeah.
allows my beer to be more than mushy, gross
Right.
water.
Sure.
So that fermentation becomes the science that's involved in creating like this Franziskaner or a bubbling masterpiece.
Right.
My
Right.
question is, when I'm drinking this, am I drinking as well a bunch of fermenting yeast
Right.
with my beer?
Right. So they're not fermenting anymore. I mean, so okay. Well, so if you drink a bottle conditioned beer, this is bottle conditioned. Sierra Nevada's pale ales, bottle conditioned. A lot of breweries bottle condition their stuff. Um, they're putting that. That just usually means they're putting yeast in that beer in the bottling line to grab whatever residual sugar is in it, and through that carbonate at least some of the way that beer. So when you open it up, it actually has carbonation to it. So by the time you get it, that yeast should be asleep, and that's really kind of what happens. The life cycle of most yeast is it does what it's supposed to do, makes a bunch of CO2 and it makes a bunch of alcohol, and then goes dormant, just falls asleep at a certain point when there's no more sugar to eat, or the alcohol gets too high for it to keep doing what it's supposed to do, and drops to the bottom or rises to the top of that beer, and you can then reuse it by cultivating it, put another beer, and then kind of starting the cycle all over again. But really, there's a funny story. This always brings to my mind about beer itself and the yeast thing. I remember in college, I was at a party. Underclassmen was like drinking probably his first wheat beer. You could kind of see him in the corner looking at it weirdly because it looked different in his solo cup, and kind of looking around and seeing everyone else drinking it. And I saw this from across the room and was like, all right. I knew the beer we had that night. We kind of put quickly two and two together when I had a sharper mind and was quicker on my feet. I was like, all right, let's have 30 seconds of fun here. And I was like, hey man, like, what's going on? What's happening? Like, how you enjoying that beer? And he kind of didn't say anything, shy, underclassmen do. And I was like, there's like basically a bunch of sleeping single cell organisms inside what you're drinking right now. That's why people call beer is a meal. You're actually eating a bunch of tiny living things. And he kind of like had that deer in its headlights look that everyone gets at some point when you're in college or when you have a beer in your hand when you shouldn't. And
No, this is Bush Light. There's nothing
exactly,
alive
right,
in here.
right.
Yeah.
And I just remember kind of the look on his face, that whole experience, and my friends kind of clued into it right away, and we had a quick laugh, and don't know if I remember that at all, but it was what a crazy night in college making science jokes at a party. Oh boy, how popular I was. But yeah, I mean, really, yes, yeast is the workhorse. It's making the breweries look good, and this beer we just had, both beers tonight were a great example of that, where yeast is front and center, and whether it's asleep already or not. Yeah, I mean, we're drinking some yeast, but it's asleep. It's just B12. It's another thing. Like the B complex is basically what yeast is. So it's great for you. It can help with hangovers to a point. I'm not saying drink a bunch of wheat beers and you'll feel great tomorrow morning, but it does have it's still beer, but
I'm
it
gonna
does have stuff you need to.
I'm gonna cut you
live.
off at vitamin complex. I have to edit these videos on YouTube, and I'm not good enough to put together an
Right.
infographic.
The FDA, right? The FDA does not sanction any beer as a vitamin.
Yeah, but seriously, drink a wheat beer, keep your kids
Right.
healthy. Nope.
Right.
So effectively, like as a brewer, a way that I could vision this in like a Looney Tunes world is that a
Yeah.
brewer comes in and like builds this farm and sets up a fence and puts the right grass in there, and then yeast come in and just make beer from the situation that the brewers create.
Right. Right.
Which does, I mean, I guess yeast is an underappreciated workhorse of craft beer.
Sure.
Are there things like, is yeast beer particularly, does it have special characteristics, or like could I like go to the pizza shop and grab some of their yeast and make a
Right.
beer with it?
Right. You get like baker's yeast or whatever you could, and homebrewers have with kind of mixed results. I mean, there are something like 10,000 known yeast strains out there, and they all could ferment beer. What you'll get like as a result may be good, may be gross and taste like a foot. It kind of comes down to the temperature it fermented at, the amount of yeast you're pitching, the generation of that yeast. So like we would reuse and repitch yeast all the time, and a lot of the storied brewers, in fact, I can't remember specifically, but Francis Connor maybe a good example of this. Of they claim to use the same. They're like a generation, 10,000 or whatever of the same yeast strain. They keep repitching it from the first beer they ever made to now, kind of like a Tootsie Roll, where they're constantly reusing the same vat of Tootsie Roll since the 1900s, but this goes back to the 1300s. In each new successive beer. So generation, yeast gets better at what they're doing the longer they've been doing it, which is kind of interesting for a single-celled organism. And then other ingredients you use as well in that beer. I mean, I was going to contribute to kind of what the yeast does with it, adjuncts, other sources of sugar that you're adding. The yeast will react to certain ways. It really likes, though, the kind of sugars that you pull off of grain and malted barley in particular. If you use a lot of adjuncts in a beer, you cannot reuse that yeast very much. It kind of just gets less and less efficient very quickly. So even the yeast itself is going, this sugar source kind of stinks. This one's a little better. It's kind of selective, which is also interesting. So, but I mean, like trying to like figure out, right, like what is that orange flavor I'm tasting? Is that coming from the yeast, the hops, the malt, an adjunct? That's kind of the fun of drinking beer, but the yeast is going to absolutely play a part in that and kind of what you're actually experiencing for sure when it comes to that sip.
So, my next question is, I'm going to try and riff off of that a little bit, and I want to play. We've mentioned before, like lager versus
Yes,
ale,
sure.
and the temperature differences. So there's a lager yeast and an ale yeast, and we'll get more into the differences between a lager and an ale
Yeah,
in later episodes. But
yeah,
while we're focusing on yeast, can you give me like a kind of a description on like what's the basic difference between a lager yeast and an ale yeast?
sure. Yeah, and we'll do this. Yeah, kind of hit the highlights here. So lager yeast, which when I say lager, I'm talking about lagers, but pilsners, Bocks, Doppelbocks, Maibocks, all that stuff. So it's known as a bottom fermenting yeast. I mean, it likes to settle at the bottom of the tank. It also finishes cleaner, produces less kind of fermentation byproducts like other flavors, hence the cleanness of the kind of neutralness of the finish of a lager yeast. It perform well in colder temperatures too. And so because they're colder, they're sometimes not as vigorous in terms of the fermentation, like El Diablo, the yeast we had earlier today in Raging Bitch. That's an ale yeast. This one's going to be dropping out of the bottom of the beer traditionally, whereas ale yeast, or kind of as I guess the part of the Saccharomyces cerevisiae family, I guess it's like family and genus, used in most beers. So these are like IPAs, but also like porters, stouts, wheat beers. Most styles of beer are ale yeast. However, most beers, because so many lagers are out there in terms of this volume amount of lager beer brewed, or lager yeast, but in terms of range of style, probably an ale. Top fermenting yeast, that's what they refer to. They perform at better and warmer temperatures, fruitier flavors, and that warmth can make them a little more vigorous in terms of how they ferment, meaning they ferment faster. When they ferment faster, they're creating CO2 faster, which creates more foam, more blow off, more of a mess. That's right. You walk into the closet again, and your shirts are covered in a bunch of beer. You probably just made an ale. My closet was probably too hot for that beer, although whatever's left may taste fantastic. And so, yeah, big pillowy heads. And really, like, ale yeast don't like liquid. Which is hilarious because they're making beer, which of course is a liquid. They're known as what's called hydrophobic. So they're trying to get out of there, trying to ferment and leave as quick as they can. So they choose going to the top of the beer because again they're kind of flocculating, which means grouping together already. Which traditionally brewers could skim the top of open fermentation vessels, the yeast up there, and move it to another tank to have fresh wort move into it and then turn that into beer. And there's even a system called the Burton Union system where they just built basically like a trough between tanks where it got to a certain point, the yeast would rise up, get into that trough, and just go to that next tank that was empty, and then it started to fill, add beer to it. This is not really done anymore, but in the UK, a lot of the ales there traditionally were brewed in a system like that, where it's almost like like an aqueduct almost of yeast moving itself to that next tank to be beer to be thrown into it or wort to be thrown into it and made beer. So pretty cool.
That's
But yeah,
that's
right.
awesome. If you're listening and you've ever brewed on a Burton Union system, please email Harrison.
Yeah.
at podcasts@untappd.com or hit us up on Twitter.
Please do.
We'd love to hear your stories about that. Here's a rando question for you, Harrison.
Yeah.
Can I just add a whole bunch of extra yeast to my beer so I can have like a 20% ABV at the end? Is that
Right.
is that a good shortcut or
Right.
life hack?
So not quite. You think, right, the more the merrier, and the more yeast, the more booze. And unfortunately, kind of like most people, they have a threshold for I can't, no more, no mas for me. I'm done. Close my tab. Like they can't consume in an environment above a certain alcohol percentage. So they'll just go to sleep, drop to the bottom, or again rise to the top, and then fermentation is done. There are yeast though. One of the most famous one is called a super Pac-Man yeast, which, as the name implies, Pac-Man can keep eating. And a lot of breweries that are trying to go for higher ABV beers will use like a house ale yeast to impart some flavor to it, because super Pac-Man is going to be very neutral and not impart a lot of flavor. And then add super Pac-Man after kind of primary fermentation is done, and the yeast flavor from the yeast they've gotten in that 7% beer to super Pac-Man takes it to like 10% or 11 or 12% or more. Champagne yeast, obviously, champagne is more alcoholic than beer most of the time. So that's another one breweries will sometimes use, especially in wheat beers. They'll put a champagne yeast in there. It'll dry it out, which is really cool. And then also be able to produce more alcohol. So yeah, the yeast, and this is very well documented by companies like White Labs and Y Yeast that produce yeast for commercial breweries and for home brewers. Kind of this yeast, really good. It'll get you to 5 to 7%, and then it's done. This one will get you to 11. This one's better at 4, better at this temperature. All this is documented now. So as a home brewer, you have great guidelines for like, I want to make this kind of beer. I need this kind of yeast, and here's why, and what it'll actually, the results it'll get me. But yeah, just dumping more in there, you'll just at some point start making bread, and that's that's not the goal.
I mean, it's not terrible, but
Sure,
that's
right.
that's interesting to hear that sometimes you can do everything that you want, and if you have a house ale yeast, you won't be able to get it to 15%.
Right.
You have to.
You have to do something else. Yeah. Yep.
So we've covered a little bit on why yeast is crucial in making beer and some variations in yeast. In the past episodes, we've kind of hinted at wild yeast. We've hinted at it a few times. We talked about like Cool Ship Brewing at Allagash, where it's like this giant. What can you kind of explain or maybe just demystify a little bit about things like how do I brew a beer and just put it in a giant room, Cool Ship? How does that like what is wild yeast? How does where do we find it? Is
Right.
it really just floating around in the air and it happens
Yeah.
spontaneously?
Right. So there's a couple things happening, and it's almost a whole entire episode of doing like like spontaneous fermentation compared with open fermentation compared with wild yeast culturing, and like inoculating certain vessels in your brewery with a certain yeast strain that is going to perform kind of a certain way. But like really, yeah, like it's hard to predict when you're talking about wild yeast, and some of them are very common in wine, and they work differently in those conditions. They wouldn't a beer. They eat different sugars, that sort of thing, than beer yeast would. They create different flavors. But yeah, it kind of comes down to how you're using that yeast. But there are plenty of breweries that cultivate their own. I know Two Roads at one in Connecticut during Hurricane Sandy that actually hit Connecticut pretty good. New York and Connecticut, it swung farther north than hurricanes usually do. They had a yeast catcher, which is like a device that sounds basically like a fancy system to catch yeast on their roof during that, cultivated yeast from that hurricane and made a beer out of it. So whatever was blowing around in the air up there, could have been local, could have been pulled up from the Gulf Stream. No idea. That was many years ago. But like a really cool experience. They were right. They cultivated that, put it in their lab, figured out what is this, what does it look like, what does it do a test batch, what does this taste like. All right, I kind of get it. Let's do a bigger batch of it and make a beer we kind of release to more people. So that's one example, pretty cool and extreme. But there are plenty of other breweries, like Tired Hands is very well known out of Philadelphia for foraging for not just ingredients in the woods, but yeast. Go grab an apple, scrape a little bit off the top of it, put it under a microscope. What's on there? There's got to be stuff. I mean, lactobacillus is the most common living thing, one of them on the planet. It's what makes yogurt and cheese and stuff. and it also can make your beer a little bit tart and sour, or if it's so there's things you may know every day that you eat every day that in yogurt or cheese tastes normal, and a beer may taste a little bit funky. But it's kind of, there's definitely more trial and error there now. But even like where we're standing today compared to 5 years in the past, we know more about a lot of these wild yeast, or how to kind of wrangle spontaneously fermented beers than ever, which is pretty cool. And it's also always a changing. You're always finding new ones. They're always kind of branching off, making new strains of themselves as they live in the world and encounter their own issues as yeast and have to adapt and all that stuff. So, it's fascinating, and obviously something that as you get deeper and deeper into beer, it's easy to kind of nerd out on and get lost in it in many different ways.
I can already kind of see how that can happen. Again, we always right now we live in a world that really stresses the importance of hops,
Yeah.
and it's amazing because they add a great flavor to most of the beers I enjoy.
Yep.
But yeast, my gosh, and you make a good point with Tired Hands. Breweries like Fonta Flora out
Mm-hmm.
closer to Asheville in North Carolina, where they'll like, I'm pretty sure I heard a story where they would forage, find an old log, and use whatever yeast was on
Right.
that to build their
Right.
beer. I mean,
Sure.
that's where it's almost like the yeast is kind of the connection between our beer today and the Sumerians that were
Sure.
brewing beer
Oh
before they
yeah.
knew what it was.
Right. Right. Exactly.
So,
Exactly right.
last question. I promise. Then we can. Then it's getting a little sciencey and stuff. But if we can go over the top, we know that essentially brewers are just yeast farmers, and we've learned about Saccharomyces, and that's basically like that's your clean beer yeast. And you talked about lactobacillus and the other sour
Yeah.
strains, Brettanomyces and
Yep. Brettanomyces and
Pediococcus.
Pediococcus. That's right. Yep.
You'll see some of those that are giving you more of a sour flavor. My question is, what happens if it's my last day as a brewer and I'm like, you know what, I'm gonna put all four of these yeasts
Sure.
into one beer, clean
Yeah.
yeast and wild yeast all together. Does that ruin it? Have people done it before? Is it a good idea?
Yeah, so I mean, many breweries do this. We did it all the time, where you can take a base beer, say like an American Porter, and you ferment it with your house ale yeast in stainless steel tanks, and let it ferment with your primary fermentation with just a standard house ale yeast, and then um, inoculate some barrels, let's say, with like lactobacillus and Brettanomyces, and then transfer that beer that's finished into those barrels, and let the bugs in the barrels do what they want to do with the other sugars there that the beer yeast wouldn't eat, would see as not fermentable and fall asleep and ignore. These other bugs are going to look at and go, oh, this is what I love to eat, and eat it up. And so we used that was all the time. We had, like I said it before, when I left, we had about 360 or 400 different barrels of beer, and we had 3 foeders, which are, if you haven't seen them, traditionally used for wine, but just like basically gigantic wooden fermenters, that we would inoculate as well. And we had 3 different ones, and one had, I think, one had a mixture of lactobacillus and pediococcus in it. One had just lacto, one had Brettanomyces and lacto, I think. And so what we'd often do is we'd always brew continuously kettle sours and put them in these bigger foeders that could hold probably 20, 30 barrels, like 60 kegs worth of beer. They were big. I think they were 30 barrel fruiters, but a beer, constantly brew a base beer, a simple kettle sour into that, see what the bugs did to it. And then when I was working with our barrel master there, we would, a lot of our day was like go to the cellar, grab samples out of the barrels. What tastes kind of good and interesting? All right, these 3 do. Let's go sample the 3 foeders now. This one would taste really good, and sit there and blend them. Take little Dixie cups and go, take a little bit of this, a little bit of this, mix it together. That's horrible. That's good. That's interesting. And then basically go like, all right, we're going to transfer, some beer from the foeder and these 3 barrels into this one tank and make it like 80% of our table beer. So that the beer coming out of that foeder and the rest are coming out of these barrels, mix it up and then bottle it. And like, that was a big part of our like brewer. I think it was called the Chamonix Creek Brewers Select Club, or the Select, whatever, like the Mug Club basically. But you're getting, when you were a member of that, you would get first like early access to these beers they were blending and bottling in the back of the brewery. That at the end of the day, like a lot of times, were a mixture of all that stuff. A base beer that wasn't soured, a couple different barrel-aged beers in different percentages of them, and they were easily like the most amazing. Well, I mean, the most amazing beers we made, I think, because it was just so much work went into them. So maybe that was part of it, where like you were part of the whole process, from which I was, of like, because in Neshaminy Creek we'd rotate around between brewing the beer, cellaring, packaging, in the barrel house. Like if you were able to kind of touch a bottle of beer at each step in some way, and then drink it, it's kind of wild to see how a year or so of waiting, what that did to a final product. And we used to do as much as we could. It was so much fun. Again, ton of work. People look at sour beers and think, wow, this is so cool and interesting. It's unforgiving, thankless, kind of you're just on your hands and knees dealing with barrels that leak and, swearing and not having fun and covered in gross, funky stuff, and everything sticks to everything else. And it's like having a toddler that you have to shove inside a bottle and then and then do so and have it be this like magic, and then wait, because you're bottle conditioning it, wait 2 weeks and then drink it and see what it tastes like. So even after that, so long story short, you can do it all, throw it all in one beer, and then even more so, take a bunch of beers that have a bunch of different bugs in it and kind of blend them together. And that's a lot of really great breweries do, that refer to themselves, some of them as blenderies or whatnot. That's what they're talking about. They're literally blending beers that were brewed independent of each other into a final product that you're tasting. And it was some of the most fun times I had. But right, fun is like a weird word, because it lasted
from the
a
description you gave earlier. It didn't. I don't know if anybody's really excited to go open a sour brewery after here at Harrison and talk about it. But on the upside,
right,
people like that tag themselves as blenderies, like Casey's Brewing and Blending, Barrel Culture in North Carolina. They're some of the top rated, producing some really exciting liquids. So enjoy them, but just remember that at some point that
right.
addressing a leaking barrel with really sticky clothes, cursing at it, because and if you've enjoyed where Harrison has gone in his addressing yeast as the fourth mandatory component of beer, stick around. We're addressing more of these in Beer 101, especially upcoming in episode 19 is going to feature fermentation. So we'll talk about, we'll get a little bit more granular, having already covered yeast. And if you have any suggestions, hit us up most easily on Twitter at That Beer Podcast, or email us, or hit us up on the Facebook group. Click on the links, find us, let us know what you're interested in. Right, Harrison?
Yeah, exactly right. And coming up on our next episode, for Beer 101, we're going to focus on sourcing materials. So kind of like, how do we get hops? How do we get grain? How do we get yeast? All that stuff that's very obviously important. We're going to take what we learned and now apply it to, it's a brew day. What do we do? How do we get here? And we're going to announce the new beers early in the Facebook group that we'll be doing for that episode. So if you're, again, not in there, jump in there. You'll be able to learn a lot and kind of get an early peek on where we are and we're thinking about, and we're drinking for the next episode beforehand.
I think that's absolutely good information. Of course I do. I can be selfish there. For those of you listening right now, we're doing something every Wednesday for as long as our families will allow us. If it's not a new episode on Drinking Socially on your podcast, then check us out in the Facebook group. We're going to be live on there. You can follow us on Twitter for updates. But we kind of tested it out last week, and it was really, really fun to interact and answer questions and talk about things with you kind of one-on-one live while drinking a beer. So we hope we can continue that.
Oh, yeah. Gonna keep it going. It was a blast. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Otherwise, show notes, links, how to get in touch with us, all that stuff's available at podcast.untappd.com. You can connect with us directly via Twitter at That Beer Podcast. Join the Facebook Drinking Socially group. I think I've covered all of the social media plugs. Smash that like button, hit subscribe.
That's right. Other than that, we'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
Cheers.
Cheers.